It's time to work on the primer lines. These are the primer lines here that came out of the old airframe. I probably don't need to replace these. They feel like they're in pretty good shape. But what happens is this copper tubing gets work hardened over time, especially in like this bend and stuff here, places where the vibrations concentrate on it. I've known of at least 3 airplanes, people that I know, that have either made emergency landings or crashed because a copper line broke. Not a primer line, but the oil pressure line broke and they lost oil or lost oil pressure in one case, and they made emergency landing because he thought he'd run out of oil. Another case, he wasn't paying any attention and did pump all the oil out, but that happens. So be safe rather than sorry. I'll go ahead and change these lines out and make up new ones. There's 2 different types of fittings on here. On the one end, the end that goes on the primer, there's a compression fitting. Uses a nut on there, a female nut, and then there's a ferrule that goes over the copper tubing. This is the ferrule here. And it slides over the tubing and then goes into a receptacle, a recessed area in the fitting on this case on the primer. And then the nut pushes down against it. It kind of compresses that ferrule tight into the copper and swedges itself into the copper, and then makes a tapered fitting in there and kind of seals itself off like that. Generally they work pretty good. The other end on here is a flared fitting, male nut instead of a female nut like you usually see. Use this a lot on brake lines and fuel lines and stuff like that. The end with the ferrule on it you don't have to do anything with. You just cut it off square, slip the ferrule over it, and slide it down into the receiving end, and then tighten the nut down up on it, and it self-tightens. You don't need any extra tools or anything. This end, of course, you need a flaring tool to flare that. Most aviation type fittings, flared fittings, are 37 degrees. That's to keep them using automotive style or cheap style fittings and stuff on aviation lines and whatnot, so you got to buy the expensive stuff to go on there. But this is an old style line. Piper, when they build everything with off-the-shelf parts. This copper line flared fitting is just a standard 45 degree fitting. I've got different ways of flaring it. I've got this little 1/8 inch flaring tool I bought years ago. It's got, I think, 45 on one side and 37 on the other side, and it had a punch that you'd put the tubing in there, clamp it down, and take a punch and just punch down in there with a hammer and flare that out. I lost the punch a long time ago. I've used this before and made my own punches. I bought this flaring tool at a estate sale several years ago, and I was hoping that it was 37 degree flaring tool and I could use it for aviation stuff, but it's not. It's a standard 45 degree flaring tool, but it's a good flaring tool. Papco. It's got all the different dies in here for the different sizes of tubing and stuff. I haven't used it since I bought it. I thought, okay, this would be a good chance to use it, but it doesn't have an 1/8 inch die in it, so that didn't work out the way I had hoped. I'm going through my Imperial Eastman set. I bought this from Eastwood Company several years ago, and it has both 47 degree or 45 degree and 37 degree flare tools on it, receptacles, and it's also got a double flaring tool so that you can do a double flare, and then it's got some swedges in there for swedging out the tubing and stuff, and it works pretty good. And I got to looking through it, and it does have the dies for the 1/8 inch tubing on there, so I'll wind up using this thing. Now the one tube goes from the primer down to the fuel gas collator, the fuel strainer on the firewall. That one will have the reverse flare fitting on one end and the swedge fitting, just the ferrule fitting on the other end to go into that, and I can make that one up to fit. The other line goes to the engine and connects into the primer line where it splits off and goes to, there's a primer line that goes to each cylinder on a 4-cylinder engine, so there's a block this goes to that tees off on the engine, and I'm not sure exactly how long that needs to be. I think this shorter line here is probably that one, but I don't need to finish it. If I just go ahead and put the ferrule on one end and put that into the primer and then run it out, then we can always cut it to length and flare it on the airplane once we know how long to make it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is cut these lines to get these nuts off of here. I want to reuse these nuts off the old lines onto the new one. There's no reason they can't be used. Well, I've got a tubing cutter here. I'll take this nut. This one's pretty clean, the other one's pretty dirty. I'm just going to drop it into some lacquer thinner to get it cleaned off. Now, there's the ferrule, and it's pretty much swedged into that copper tubing. You can't really reuse those, so you can reuse the nut, but it can't reuse the ferrule. Now, I'll do the same thing on this end with the reverse flare fitting. I'll just cut that off and take that nut off and clean it up too. And this end here, before I do anything with it, I'm going to take the file and flatten that end off and take any burrs off of it and make sure, chamfer the hole in there. It doesn't make any difference whether this is the end that the ferrule goes on or this is the end that flares. If it's the end that flares, it really needs to be taken care of. The ferrule end doesn't need so much, but I'll still take the burr off of that so any fluid, the gas will flow through there cleanly. There's my primer line hookup. This is the pressure line, or the line that comes from the primer to the engine. Comes out the top here, and that's got that compression fitting on it. Got a nice loop in here to absorb any shock, vibration. It should keep it from cracking and stuff there. And then it runs out fairly straight and out this grommet out here in the front. This line here, lower one, goes down in the bottom. And again, there's a nice loop right there for shock absorption. It goes in the bottom of the primer here on this fitting. Again, that's a compression fitting there. So, go down, bring them up together, coming out this top grommet, this top hole. I put some heat shrink tubing around them where they go around that bend right there, so they rub together and stuff, just to keep them from chafing. Here's where they come out. This one is the line coming from the sump, or from the gascolator, and this one is the one that'll go to the engine. Come down the firewall, hooked on with an AN 742 number 3 clamp right there. And we'll have to cut these screws off of there one of these days. The muffler rides right tight up against in there, but this one comes down. Here's where it ties into the gascolator here. This is where it sucks fuel out of the gascolator up into the primer and then pushes it out through this tube into the engine. I cut this tube off and just left it down there. I hope it's long enough. I think it's more than long enough, but the engine will just come out to about, well, maybe here or so where it hooks into the primer line. So this will bend up here and come into that, and I'll put that nut on there then when we get ready to hook it up. But until we get something to hook it up to, there's no point in getting excited about it. So the primer's installed. Now we gotta get some of the other cables put in for the cabin heat, carburetor heat mixture. Figure out where they come out of those holes at.